numbers 9 and 6. Okay. Female, senior. She's smoking a pipe. She's laughing. Okay, now I'm inside a room. Window panes, aluminum extrusion. 2 figures resolving in the room.
I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Like you, be strong to hold the powers of the sun.
Listen to Pavarotti.
Can I be your superhero?
Hello, welcome to The Revealing. I'm your host, Pavarotti, and I'm here to discuss the Idaho 4 case. And, in this episode, what I've got to do is discuss something as it relates to what I believe happened around the roommates. Because every time that I bring it up, because I believe we're so, programmed to believe everything that we've talked about for 2.5 years as it relates to the roommates and Dylan opening the door 3 times and hearing, I'm here to help and all this kind of stuff. It really makes it difficult when somebody suggests something totally different happened, even if I have all the evidence in the world to back it up. So what I want to do is explain in no uncertain terms, in the most factual, logical way that I can possibly do it, using what we know in the record to explain why law enforcement would need to alter the entire situation around the roommates. And what I'm really looking to do is not show that the roommates weren't involved, not show that, anybody wasn't involved or try to solve the crime in this manner. I'm not saying anything's wrong at this point, but what I want to do is explain just in just simple, no uncertain terms, why law enforcement would need to lie about the roommates if it happened the way that I say it happened, because of what I've looked at as far as the evidence to that, why they would need to say something different. They would need to put DM in the house. They would need to put her opening the door 3 times and put her 3 feet from the assailant to make the identification of bushy eyebrows and height and weight and skinny and athletic build. And he's white. I don't know how I know he's white. I just know he's white. Well, I know how you know he's white because they told you to say he's white. But what I want to do is give you the most logical, factual evidence that supports why they would do this. And I think it also supports, if it happened the way that I said it happened, they had to do it that way. And we're going to take a little ride right here, folks. So hold on to your hats. Okay, so before we dive into it, we have to establish some facts. And this is a factual timeline of events as it relates to what I'm going to be discussing in this video. And you can see the timeline starts up here with 11/13, the day of the atrocity, with DM and BF. Now, we know now that not one word was mentioned about DM and BF to the public until 3 days later on November the 16th, where the roommates are first mentioned by Chief Fry, and all that he said was they were there that night. That is all that he would confirm in the press conference and later in the press release. Now, he also said that investigators met daily with the prosecutors and the university to craft their stories, which kind of tells the real story here. But we also know that on 11/13, that same day, the investigators or detectives on scene, Nunez and Mowry, got statements from both DM and we assume BF. We know they had to get at least one statement from her. We assume 2, but we can also assume that after that, we know through the Steve G text that both of them lawyered up, and Bethany's family has a lot of power in town, and you can bet she wasn't involved in any of the other statements from the witness after the 13th. I believe. So I can't say that's a fact, but that's what I believe. And the record doesn't show anything else about BF. So I would have to assume that. But DM does have more statements that she's making to law enforcement. She's brought back in on November 17th to Detective Gooch of the Idaho State Police. And this is the interview where supposedly she gives the description of the suspect, actually has a balaclava picture handed to her so that she can redraw it later. And this is the first time she mentions anything about a bushy eyebrow. Now, she was brought back in again on December 1st for some reason to give Detective Williamson the story again. So for some reason, they needed to talk to DM 4 times that we know of that's on the record before they ever even supposedly had Koberger's name on December 19th. But then we know on December the 23rd, a warrant was applied for and issued by AT&T, and it was for Koberger's 8458 phone number. Then we know on December 30th that they brought Dylan back in one more time to see if she could identify Koberger, and she could not. So that's the facts of the timeline, and it's also a timeline that shows where things could be manipulated. So as we move forward, I'm going to go ahead and tell you what I believe happened that night. So this is not a factual timeline. This is just what I believe happened, and I truly believe this is what happened. At 2 a.m., I believe either Dylan and Bethany, or possibly just Dylan, returned back to the King Road residence, or sometime before that. I believe at 2:10:27, she texted Eric Gower for a ride. At 2:13, Eric Gower texted her back and said he was driving, and I believe he then proceeded over there and picked up either just Dylan or picked up Dylan and Bethany. But either Bethany was there and she left with Dylan at 2:30, or when Eric Gower got there to get him, or Bethany was never there and that was just Dylan. So either way, I don't know which. There's no way I can determine that. But I know the next thing that happened was at 3:51, Dylan creates a new contact in her phone, which strongly indicates to me she was out and about and met somebody. And then the next communication we see is at 4:19, where Bethany calls Dylan. I believe that this phone call happened as Dylan is on her way back to the King Road residence. She would have been just around the corner when this phone call happened, which is very interesting when I look at things one more time of exactly where Dylan would have been as Bethany made that phone call to her, where they would have been driving by. But anyway, there's no way to truly determine what was said on this phone call because it was a phone call. It was testified to in the grand jury. And for those of you out there that think Bethany didn't testify in the grand jury, you're absolutely wrong, because in the court record, it shows that the information comes from her grand jury testimony. So she testified in the grand jury. And what she testified to basically was what Dylan had told her and what conversations they had had on these 2 phone calls at 4:19 and 4:20 and 20 seconds. Now, the 4:19 call, she testified that Dylan had told her that she thought she had heard something. There's no way to verify that, and there's nothing else in the following text that really corroborate what she says as far as Dylan telling her that she thought she heard something. But the next call is made from Dylan to Bethany, as I believe she's pulling into the King Road residence at 4:20 and 20 seconds. And we know on this call that in the grand jury testimony, she testified that she had told Bethany that she had seen somebody that was dressed basically like a ninja. And we can corroborate that because not only did they testify to that, but also from the following text messages where BF texts her back and says, wait a minute, Xana was wearing all black, as to say maybe you had just seen Xana. So I think that actually corroborates what they're saying happened on that phone call, that Dylan said she had seen somebody dressed in black. And the following text messages after that, I believe, are actually real text messages that accurately depict what was going on. So here's the thing, though. If Dylan had seen what I believe was an assailant leaving the King Road residence, He was probably dressed in black wearing a ski mask. But if she's seen him from a vehicle and it's nighttime and there's a distance between them, then I don't believe she would be able to describe the assailant in near as much detail as law enforcement suggests that she did. But we'll put that on the back burner for right now, because I believe next that Dylan probably went into the house, seen Anna laying on the floor, and then got out of there. She may have seen a lot more than that, but got out of there at 4:32. And then I've got a lot more on what I believe happened that night, but I'm just going to stick to this right now and follow this line of progression, because if this is truly what happened, why would law enforcement say that both Dylan and Bethany were home all night and concoct the story that they concocted that we've all heard for 2.5 years? This is why. When you look at the evidence that was used for the arrest of Brian Kohberger in the probable cause affidavit, and at that time, what was in the probable cause affidavit was the evidence that they had against Brian Kohberger. All the other stuff that we hear about now, they discovered all of that so-called evidence. I mean, it's irrelevant evidence, but all that so-called evidence long after Brian Kohberger was arrested. So what did they have when they arrested Brian Kohberger? They had a shady DNA match to Brian Kohberger's father. You know, they didn't have his match until after the arrest. So that could be only described as weak circumstantial evidence at best. They had the fact that Kohberger's phone was not reporting to the network during the time of the crime. Well, that means that they can't place Kohberger in the area because of his phone, so that's actually exculpatory. The CSLI data showing that he was not near the area when his phone was on would also be exculpatory. Possible previous trips to Moscow, that would be irrelevant. The fact that Kohberger drives an Elantra, but there's no verification that it's his Elantra, so therefore that would be irrelevant. Kohberger has bushy eyebrows. That was provided by the eyewitness testimony of DM. Kohberger fits the description of the suspect's height and weight. Again, that's provided by the eyewitness DM. And Kohberger's vehicle didn't have a front license plate. Well, without any verification that it's actually Kohberger's vehicle, all that would do is limit. That's called limiting evidence. Means it would limit the total number of Elantras you could be looking at, which certainly wouldn't be enough to justify an arrest. So they needed all of this together for the arrest warrant, because according to them, they hid the IGG from the magistrate for some unknown reason. I happen to believe it's because it wasn't real. But whatever reason they had, they hid it from the magistrate, and they couldn't include that in the arrest warrant. So let me show you why law enforcement needed to craft the story that they did around the roommates being there that night. Because if it happened the way that I believe it happened, that Dylan was pulling back in to the King Road residence at 4:20 and 20 seconds, just like we see the vehicle pass Linda Lane and we hear it pulling up into the house at 4:20 and 20 seconds, right 8 seconds before she calls Bethany. I believe as she's pulling in, one of the assailants is coming out of the house and he's heading to a vehicle that is sitting there waiting to pull out of there. And that could be the only way that somebody could get from the house to a vehicle and pull out of there that fast in 21 seconds if she's pulling in and dialing BF as she sees him. Now, she may have seen another assailant that was running towards the Linda Lane apartments, getting in that sport utility and taking off as well, or she may not have seen that other assailant. If she did see him, he was probably in his underwear. But I believe this is the way the actual identification took place, and I think we have to look at the calls and texts as verification that that identification did take place, just not in the manner that law enforcement wishes that it did and they put in their probable cause affidavit. But this is what I believe happened. Now, if this is the case, all DM could witness is a man dressed in black, wearing a ski mask possibly, at nighttime and from a distance, an accurate height, weight, skinny but athletic. The fact that he's white, I don't know how I know he's white, but I just know he's white. And most certainly bushy eyebrows, would be close to impossible at nighttime from a distance, and therefore wouldn't corroborate what law enforcement would need to take to the magistrate for an arrest warrant. So that means that they would have to make her eyewitness identification much more up in your face for it to be considered something worthy of taking to a magistrate to get a warrant. And let me show you how important that would turn out to be. When you look at the evidence in the PCA for the arrest at that time that we just looked at, but then we start to go through and realize some truths that we now know to this day. The fact that they could not include the IgG for whatever reason. And the fact that if you take out the detailed eyewitness testimony of Dylan, which is that Kohberger had bushy eyebrows and he fits the description of the suspect's height and weight, well, then the other evidence doesn't really look as strong. And without the eyewitness statements, the undisclosed nature of the IgG, how they could even explain the trash pull to the magistrate for BK's DNA match would have been an interesting conversation to say the least. But let's look at it a different way that's a little bit easier to digest. Evidence for arrest in the PCA. If you took out Dylan's eyewitness testimony, this is all they had. Kohberger's phone was not reporting to the network. CSLI data showing that he's not near the area. Possible previous trips to Moscow. He does drive an Elantra with no front license plate. Oh yeah, and then we got the shady DNA match to BK's father. You see, you need the eyewitness statements of the description of the suspect with a detail to make all of this plausible. But I'm going to give you the real reason why they had to lie. And this is going to be very evident, and it's going to slap you right in the face. The evidence for them to obtain the AT&T warrant on December 23rd. Again, they can't bring up the IgG for whatever reason. So what was their evidence they had for the AT&T warrant? Because without the AT&T warrant, they don't have CSLI data. They don't have any of the, post-atrocity data. They don't have any of that. So what did they need to get that warrant? They had Kohberger drives an Elantra. He matches the suspect's description of bushy eyebrows, height, weight, and he doesn't have a front license plate. This is what they actually use, these four things, to establish probable cause to get the warrant for AT&T. Now, what happens when you remove DM's description of the suspect and their ability to obtain the AT&T warrant? Uh-oh. The evidence for the AT&T warrant would have included Kohberger drives an Elantra with no front license plate. That is it. And if all Dylan could testify to was, well, I seen a guy dressed in black from a distance, I think he was wearing a ski mask, well, that certainly would not have helped in the evidence that they needed in probable cause for obtaining the AT&T warrant. So what did they need to do? They needed to say, okay, he's within 3 feet of her, so we can get a good description of his height, weight, what his, is he Caucasian? And we need a feature, right? He's skinny but athletic and bushy eyebrows. Without all of that, they had absolutely nothing. And when you think about the prosecution, the university, and the investigators meeting on a daily basis, discussing issues like this, how are we going to get a search warrant? Because we know they already had that AT&T warrant. They already had that information. The FBI had already pulled it. That's already been, in my opinion, dropped in the courtroom. So, but they had to have legitimate evidence to get the AT&T warrant from the state level so that it would make their case make sense. And the fact that Kohberger drives an Elantra with no front license plate wasn't going to do it. And when we go back to the old PCA, it's right in our face. As we go through, they talk about when everybody got home, oh, all this stuff happened. They found the victims. They get these statements from DM and BF, and they go through about Chapin and Kernodle, and they lie about when they got home. They returned to the King Road residence at 1:45. We know that's now not true because it says in the new court filings that they don't know when they got home, but it's definitely after 2:10. They go through, when Maddie and Kaylee got home, and more statements from the roommates. See, nothing about Brian Here's Murphy the dog. Nothing about Brian Kohberger at this point. In fact, the first thing that you'll ever see in here where they start alluding to Brian Kohberger is right here. Dylan opened up her door and she saw somebody she described as 5'10" or taller, male, not very muscular, athletically built with bushy eyebrows. This description right here was very, very important to them getting the AT&T warrant. Without this, they would have never got it. If Dylan actually seen the assailant from a distance at night in her vehicle, then she's never going to be able to determine how tall he is, not very muscular, certainly wouldn't see any eyebrows. But as you go through and you start looking for evidence against Kohberger, the first time we hear of any evidence is review of multiple videos obtained from the King Road neighborhood shows videos of a suspect vehicle. And then the FBI identifies the vehicle as a 2011 to 13, could be 11 to 16. Then on November 20th, we got WSU footage, and we determined that that one was a 2015. So because we determined that one was a 2015, we decided the vehicle was 2015. But then we get to on November 25th, they asked law enforcement in the area to look out for those white Hyundai Elantras. And then Tiango finds Kohberger's at his apartment, right? And this vehicle was registered to Kohberger. And then on that same day, Whitman, he was looking for Elantras, found Kohberger's. And what did he do? Well, Whitman ran the car and it returned to Kohberger with a Washington tag. He reviewed Washington State license information and photograph, and this is intricate in getting the AT&T warrant. The license indicate that Kohberger's a white male with a height of 6 foot, weighs 185 pounds. Additionally, the photograph of Kohberger shows that he has bushy eyebrows. Kohberger's physical description is consistent with the description of the male DM saw inside the King Road residence on November 13th. This is what got the AT&T warrant right here, the suspect's description. Without this statement, a search warrant for AT&T would have never been granted. Kohberger was detained as part of a traffic stop, and then Kohberger provided his phone. It was 8458 number. Now, what did they do once they got Kohberger's phone number? Well, they kept on looking, and they said, well, he doesn't have a front license plate. Okay, we got a little more. And then they kept looking, and they finally said, he's a white male. That's consistent with Dylan's description. But since we got his phone, let's go ahead and utilize the tower dump. As part of this investigation, law enforcement obtained search warrants to determine cellular devices that utilize cellular towers in close proximity to the King Road residence on November 13, 2022, between 3 and 5 a.m. After determining that Kohberger was associated to the white Elantra and the phone, investigators reviewed these search warrants. A query of the 8458 phone and these returns did not show the 8458 utilizing cellular tower resources in close proximity to the King Road residence between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. So they did the query and it's exculpatory. Kohberger wasn't there. But then they say individuals can either leave their cellular phone at a different location before committing a crime or turn their phone off prior to committing the crime. And then on December 23rd, I applied for the AT&T search warrants. That's all they had. And by the way, I love, because everybody knows everything at this point, when you try to point out to them that the tower dump around the King Road area did not include Kohberger's phone when they looked it up. And then they said criminals can turn their phone off for committing a crime. And people will justify that and say, yeah, well, they know that he turned his phone off at 2:48 or 2:54. So that's very suspicious. But at this point, because they hadn't actually applied for the AT&T warrant, they had no earthly idea that Koberger had even left his apartment. They didn't have his telephone information to show his phone wasn't reporting to a network. All they had was the tower dump of the area, and Koberger's phone wasn't in it. So when you look at the evidence that they had up to that point, and then you find out that on December the 19th is when Brett Payne testified to in court that he finally had the conversation with the WSU cop about Koberger's car and this bogus information about his license matching the physical description. You don't find out that that didn't happen until December the 19th. So when they found his car on November 29th, all they did was find a car. And it was just like the other cars that they found that they were asked to keep an eye out for. The investigators never paid it any attention. So that means that after December 19th is when they looked up Koberger's driver's license information and said, okay, look, it matches the suspect's description. You can bet after December 19th is when they came up with the suspect's description, because guess what? They had it right there on his license. And they looked on his license and it looked like he had some bushy eyebrows. That's when they made DM change her story from pulling into the driveway to being in the house in the bedroom. They put both of them in there that night. And that's why they didn't say anything about those roommates for 3 days after the investigation. And you didn't hear anything about that night until the probable cause affidavit came out, because they had already included all that in the warrant to get the AT&T warrant. And from that point, they were stuck with it. But they had to have it to get the AT&T warrant. Without it, they wouldn't have got it. So that's why they had to go through and make up and stick to that story that they made up in the beginning. Those roommates were never there. So that explains why they would need to manipulate the roommate story and put them at the house. But when we go back to the factual timeline and we go through and we see on December 20th that we know now, verified with Brett Payne on the stand, he admitted that December 20th was the first time he ever had a conversation with the WSU police officers about Koberger's Elantra that they had logged. So that tells us that that is the first time that anybody ever looked up Koberger's driver's license for his description. And this is most likely when the false story would be crafted for the roommates and their eyewitness description of Brian Koberger. Because if you find a spot where you know law enforcement lied and manipulated the story to fit the facts, that's most likely when all the lies took place. Now, we talk all the time about, in the court case, fruit of the poisonous tree. If one warrant gets thrown out, then the next one gets thrown out, and then the case gets thrown out. Well, this isn't a case of fruit of the poisonous tree. This is a case of investigation of the poisonous tree. Because before I can even hear the comments in my comment section about, yeah, but they had him also, Pavarotti, going to Lewiston and Clarkston the next day and going into that grocery store wearing those gloves. And then they had him wearing gloves, putting things in a baggie at his parents' house. And they had all this. And they had that K-bar knife. Well, let me tell you, they didn't have any evidence of Koberger ever purchasing anything off Amazon. It says it in the warrants until, was it April or May of 2023, long after he was arrested. Without that AT&T warrant, they didn't have any cast data on him at all. They had no idea where they even thought that he went after the unalivings. They didn't have the path of the return trip they tried to say was his. They didn't know he went to the grocery store and wore gloves the next day. They would have never got to the point to where he was at his parents' house wearing gloves, putting things in baggies. All of that came after the AT&T warrant. More importantly, how would they be able to explain going and pulling Brian Koberger's trash from his parents' house and trying to match Brian Koberger's DNA to his father's with the basis of he drives a Elantra without a front license plate? Because without the description of DM and some other manipulating language from law enforcement, that is literally all they had until they got the AT&T warrant. Then it didn't really get much better. But until they got the AT&T warrant, that is all they had. Going to a magistrate with he drives a similar vehicle as one we think it is, and he doesn't have a license plate, and we don't think that vehicle did. And you want to get a warrant on him, you'd have to get a warrant on 100,000 people and go check their DNA. It's not how it works, pal. Oh yeah, well, our witness, she was 3 feet from him, and he had bushy eyebrows, and he was a white guy, and he fit his height, weight, and build. Okay, well then all the other BS you're telling me then adds up. I'll let you have this warrant. That's why they would have to manipulate the story. That's why they would have to put the roommates in the house that night so that they could accurately depict the situation around when they got the eyewitness identification. And that's why they didn't take her actual statements. They took pieces from her statement and worded it a little bit cryptic, but not too cryptic for the magistrate not to believe it in the probable cause affidavit. But for all those out there that say, oh, why would they even do that? I wanted to go through just in the most factual way possible, taking all the information that we know now in the real timeline of events and the actual facts at that time, and show you exactly why they would have them do that. Can't wait to hear your comments on this one. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Post your comments, thoughts, criticisms. Till next time, Pavarotti's out.